they're all important questions, but I'm going to just use the boycott question as a way of framing what I think is one way of thinking about what's going on vis-a-vis Israel. I'm not sure if some of my colleagues will agree or disagree, but I guess if we disagree, it'll be better. I think it's, if you go to a place like Yad Vashem, or you go to a place like the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C., or any of the ones that are around the various communities of the world, and in all of the countries from which you come. One of the things that I think you notice, or that's counterintuitive to a certain extent, is you walk into these exhibits and you expect to be bombarded immediately with pictures of emaciated bodies behind barbed wire and piles of hair and piles of shoes and so on and so forth, which you often get, but you don't get it at the beginning of the exhibit. The first third of the exhibit typically is about what was happening in, let's take Yad Vashem's case particularly, what was happening in Europe long before the first Jew was killed. And what's really important in these parts of the exhibits is what's happening in the German press, what's happening in German culture, how the legal structures of German society are all setting up the Jew as other, as marginal, as etc. Basically Germany, and here's the critical point, Germany preparing Europe for the idea of a continent without Jews. Germany did its homework extremely well, so that by the time the mass murder apparatus was put into place, the idea of a continent without Jews was much less unthinkable than it would have been in the early 1920s when Hitler first wrote Mein Kampf. In other words, at that point you couldn't do what Nazi Germany ultimately decided to do, because the world wasn't there. Where the Jews were in Berlin and in Vienna and so on and so forth made it so obvious that the Jews were central to Europe, the idea of eradicating the Jews would have been unthinkable. It was after the very, very effective work of Germany and others in advance of preparing the world to think differently about the Jew, then the eradication of the Jew was so taken for granted that it happened all across Europe with virtually no resistance. The United States closed her borders, Canada closed her borders, the British closed the borders of Palestine, so on and so forth. Now, what in the world does it have to do with Israel advocacy? It has to do with the following. I think that you can make the argument that exactly what Nazi Germany was doing in the late 20s and in the early 30s, early to mid 30s, preparing Europe for the idea of a continent without Jews, is what's actually happening now in the international community vis-a-vis Israel. Is problematic on a large number of levels. You have to remember that this is a country with a population less than that of greater metropolitan Los Angeles, so that if you were to say to most academics in Los Angeles, you're going to pursue your academic career, but only attend conferences that take place in Los Angeles, those people's careers would come to a complete halt. And if living in Los Angeles meant that that was all you could do, you would eventually leave Los Angeles. And that's, of course, the exact idea behind the boycott. The idea is to make it ultimately impossible for Israel's shining lights to do their work while living here. So you create eventually a flow of a brain drain by having people move from here to the States, to Europe, to Australia, wherever else. But it's much more than that. It actually, once again, does exactly the same thing compared to what was happening to the Jews 60, 70 years ago, which is the state of Israel is other. It's the only country in the world whose problematic or potentially problematic policies should lead to that kind of a boycott. In other words, not that there's that many Sudanese intellectuals, but there are some, and they're not being boycotted. There are all sorts of countries that have all sorts of policies that are not being boycotted. It's only this country, and of course not Palestinians. Palestinian academics are not being boycotted. This is perceived now by that particular organization in England as being a single-sided issue. There is right and there is wrong, and we are the wrong, and it's black and white. That prepares the world to see Israel as other. That's what begins to prepare the world to think about the possibility of an international community in which this country doesn't exist. You can take simply the title of Jimmy Carter's latest book. In other words, it's very important to remember that F.W. de Klerk did not wake up one morning and decide that he really loved Nelson Mandela. He didn't have an epiphany. This was not the story of Amazing Grace, where a person had some sort of theological insight. His country was being pulled apart. His country was being destroyed. And therefore he understood that in order to save what was left of South Africa, it had to be completely turned around. And the South Africa that emerged from the ashes was not the same country with different policies. Different country, completely different country. Completely different government, completely different ideas behind the government, different flag, same name. That's the only thing that was remained the same. And when Jimmy Carter writes a book that uses apartheid in the title, it's exactly the same thing. It's about stating fundamentally that there is something illegitimate about this enterprise that does not deserve to exist. Imagine that any member of the European Union, I don't know, take France, gets up tomorrow and says, Sarkozy gets up tomorrow and says he doesn't like Belgium. Belgium just rubs him the wrong way. It's time for Belgium to be wiped off the face of the planet. even if he doesn't do anything about it. Just imagine the hue and cry in the international community if Sarkozy says tomorrow Belgium's got to go. They make bad chocolate. They were once a colonial force. Whatever his excuse is, imagine.
French fries, not Belgian fries.
There you have it. There you have it.
But so, you have it with Taiwan, no?
But wait, you have it? No, not really. I mean, China denies Taiwan's legitimacy fundamentally, but it's not going out there advocating on a day-by-day basis that Taiwan should be eradicated. Not to my understanding, at least.
But,
let me just finish the thought, and then I'm almost done.
And you don't have to go down the hard route, okay? That's
right.
Don't take the exception.
So the point of this is, if you now, of course, the same thing has happened with two other countries that are members of the General Assembly. One of them, of course, is Iran, and one of them is Israel. And we could go on and on and on with many examples. But this is, I think, the fundamental point that needs to be understood here is twofold. Number one, this is not the only country in the world that has very controversial policies. When the United States invaded Iraq, George Bush said that it was not to destroy Iraq, but it was to return Iraq to the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people doesn't actually exist, which is a slight problem, which is why they've run into some difficulties there. But the bottom line is this is the only country in the world whose right to exist is a subject of legitimate discussion among intellectually sophisticated, liberally minded people. That's the point that has to be remembered. This is the only country on the planet where liberal-minded people in London and in San Francisco and in Britain and in Melbourne and wherever else can actually sit around cafes and discuss should it or should it not have a right to exist? Should it or should it not have a right to exist? And therefore, I think that that's the point of the academic boycott. The academic boycott is not important only because of its impact on Israeli intellectuals and academics, so that's very important. But it's important because it's a signal of a much larger trend taking place in the international community, which is, I would go so far as to argue, that pieces and members of the international community, Jimmy Carter and Ahmadinejad and liberals in all sorts of places, and what's his name, the guy from the New York Review of Books, Tony Judt, and so on and so forth, and many, many, many others are actually busy doing what the Nazis were doing in the early part of the pre-Shoah period, late 20s, early to mid-30s, preparing the world for the idea that maybe this country shouldn't exist. And we know from Jewish history how effective such preparatory campaigns can be. And therefore, I would simply conclude by saying that in Israel advocacy, defense is a critical issue, Lebanon is a critical issue, the issue of the Jewish and democracy are critical issues. They are all very, very complicated, and hopefully we can talk about all of them this morning. But I think that as Israel advocates from across the globe, if I could say just one sentence, it would be this concluding sentence, which is that you need to understand that I think we now live in a period in which the world, various actors in the world at least, are preparing the international community for the idea of a world without Israel, and there are plenty of players out there who'd like to see that happen, so it's much more than a rhetorical kind of an issue.